We're
Okay.
on. All right.
Do I have to sign
Uh,
in?
yeah, it says recording on there. Can you see on there a little recording thing?
Yeah. Mhm.
Okay. Well, so thank you for agreeing to participate in this. I'll just say the requisite uh, stuff. I'm Matthew Sims speaking via Zoom with Elyn Zimmerman. And where exactly is your home studio located?
My home is really New York City, but I am right now in a rental in
Mhm.
Kent, Connecticut.
Okay, so you're in Kent, Connecticut, and it is August 17th, 2020. And this is for the Archives of American Art, Smithsonian Institution. And what we're doing is we're calling this, you may come up with a better name, but it's called the Pandemic Project so far.
Oh dear.
So, and it's because we wanted to check in with our friends, such as yourself, to see how are you doing in the midst of all of this. Of course, so many different things happening, disruptions. But sometimes, interesting enough, I found that some people have said that, there hasn't been as much disruption as you'd think. So, uh, how are you doing? How are you faring in this?
It's more, I think it's a little more complicated if if you do the kind of artwork that depends on commissions and, structures being built and, or gardens being designed or so on. It's not, it is probably very different for someone who goes to their studio and works hours every day, all day, every day of the week and so on. So that's a continuum. I feel like I hit a wall, and it's not unpleasant. It's just that it's so different. And I've been working steadily on projects for years. I mean, not sometimes one or two at a time. Sometimes there's a fallow period. Other times it gets real busy. But since January, it's like my phone's been disconnected. It's really been.
Well, and is it in part because of the just melees, the sort of feeling of being kind of not sure what the next step is, or is that you actually feel like everybody is just hunkered down
Oh, I
and
think a lot of things that started to be in the works got stopped. There was a park that I was part of a team. We were finalists in the competition, and the whole thing just got shut down. So yeah,
where was that? Where was this
in
coming
Miami,
from?
in
In Miami?
Miami.
Okay.
But over the years, I also do studio work, mainly drawing and photography. For the photography part of it, I usually depend on um, a more skilled technical assistant because I take the pictures myself, but all the digital, preparations, I don't know Photoshop, Lightroom, whatever they are, very well. And for someone 20, 30 years younger than I am, they just zipped right through it. So I've always had an assistant, and I still do. But because starting in March, he lives way out in Brooklyn and
Mm.
had to take the subway, and something he didn't want to do and something I didn't want him to do. So for 3 months, I didn't see anybody. So again, it was like what had been a twice a week, all day event just stopped. Listen, I am so grateful that I still go to the city, but where I lived there was terrible looting, and it was very violent. And after the third night of it, I called a friend and I said, I just don't feel safe at all. Can you see if there's a rental anywhere near you? And she came up with this. So, and I'm very grateful, and it's beautiful, and I'm happy.
Yeah.
So
Well, I mean, I'm fascinated in so many things that you've just said. First of all, this idea of working with drawing, photography, these are things that go right back to the earliest work that certainly I know of yours, where you were working between photography and drawing in ways that were incredibly well conceptual, but also very very experiential, interfacing with the light and space dialogue that was happening, but pushing it in new directions. And so you were still very actively involved with photography and that relationship between, yeah.
I really never stopped photography and drawing. I mean, I've had episodes where I haven't done very much, excuse me, because I was busy with sculpture projects. One second.
Yeah.
Getting to be hay fever season time on the East Coast.
You know, and I hear it's raining too. Is it raining out there? Is that I remember here, I thought I heard from someone it's raining. Out here it's humid and a bit smoky because of forests, of the fires, so.
Here it rained all day yesterday, but it's always humid here in the end of the summer. It rains a lot. But anyway, no, I've been working with drawing and stuff. I have to say, in a curious way, I've not been inspired. This has all been between the political dramas that we're going through and the social justice issues that are just, so clear, and the pandemic. I just feel like the world is in a crisis. It's and we're not, our country's not handling it very well. I just don't feel inspired. So what I have been doing a lot of is reading. And first I read everything I could about the pandemic, including a very important book by, Laurie Garrett called The Coming Plague. And it's not about this pandemic, but it was about Ebola and AIDS and so on. Anyway, I've just been reading a lot.
Right. I thought you were going to say Camus' The Plague, because everybody I've mentioned.
And then when I told someone that, they said, "Oh, well, have you read the first chapter of the? Is it the Decameron?
I think yes.
Yeah. Where they're escaping the plague in 13th century Italy, and so I read that. I mean, I'll read anything as long as.
So anyway. It's a time of a kind of recentering around of some reading, picking up, and also perhaps, like you said, feeling a bit like what's next, what's the future hold? I think a lot of people feel that way, that sense of uncertainty.
Right. It's a little different when you don't have children. I mean, because you hear about what young people are thinking when you have children. I do talk to my nephews and nieces, but it's not the same. And I get surprised by some of the things they say to me. And maybe I'm a child of the 60s in California and have always, been a Democrat. I don't know. It's just a different world right now. And
well, one of the things that I know you've been dealing with relatively recently is the events around the National Geographic Society and the proposal that emerged of a pretty massive remodel of that space. And of course, you have one of your most significant, in my opinion, like one of your most significant pieces, Maribor, is a piece of permanent outdoor, site-specific environmental work incorporating their granite boulders. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So something that has been there since the 1980s, and all of a sudden there was this. Would you mind, kind of, for people who don't know, maybe walking a little bit through what happened, how that played out?
In 1980, I was selected to do a sculpture for the National Geographic, and I worked with, at the time, a young architect named David Childs, who later became head of SOM. And David, in a lot of projects, artists are brought in but not supported by the architects, the landscape architects. These SOM couldn't have been better. They helped me make a model. They found an engineer. They found a hydraulic engineer. I mean, I wouldn't have been able to do what I did without their support and help. And honestly, the National Geographic at that time was owned by the Grosvenor family. It'd been in their hands for I don't know how many generations. To say it was conservative was an understatement. And their board was fairly conservative. However, they liked the idea of the rocks, and one of the people in charge of, well, working with the architect from the National Geographic side was the editor of the magazine, Bill Garrett. And he was incredibly supportive too. So because of that, this crazy idea I had of these giant boulders cut in half, polished on the inside, you know, came to be. And honestly, if they hadn't been a totally private corporation, I don't think they could have, I mean, they just could afford it. And this is I had done one previous permanent thing, which was very small, outdoors. This was my largest piece I'd ever done. And honestly, I didn't know what I was asking of all these people. But it happened, and it became, I think, very beloved. And people, you know, got married in front of it, and they had events around it was the main plaza between these three buildings. So it was very, it was well used.
And we didn't mention there's a key water element to it. That
Yep.
it's not just the rocks, it's about the relationship between the sort of the apparently static and this mobility of the surface of the water, and all of the sound elements that are part of water as well. So really
And
rich.
the garden was part of it too. I worked with their landscape architect, Jim Urban, who I still am in contact with. This was a really supportive project, and it was dedicated in 1984. And yes, I think that things have changed over the last 40 years, and there's no fence or curb around the pool. And I've had in other projects where there's a pool of water, had to install a shallow curb so that you just don't step into the water.
Right.
And I don't have a problem with that. I think that's reasonable. About 2 years ago, the National Geographic, somewhere in the last 10 years, National Geographic was sold to the Fox Corporation, you know, Murdoch and all those people. And one part of their enterprise was siphoned off and given or sold to Disney. And that is the film and video, you know, the adventure stuff. So if I can explain, I don't mean to take so much time, but
Please.
The buildings are approached through a kind of a narrow channel from the street. There's plantings everywhere, but you go into each building separately. And I think for security reasons, because this is still not a very high secure area in Washington, they probably wanted to do something to ensure more security. And their idea was to put in a glass pavilion that you came from the street into the glass pavilion and then went to the different entrances to the buildings. And all that makes sense. But what they did was that they positioned it where the sculpture, its title is Maribor, is located, or part of it is located. And in there, and anything in the DC area, you have to go through a number of different review boards. And I know about this because I was a commissioner for the Fine Art Commission for 5 years. And that was very, you know, enlightening to me. But anyway, so they did not show in their drawing, they just erased Maribor, the pool, the rocks, the whole thing. They just erased it, and they just said, we're going to put the pavilion here. And no one on the commission, there are 5 people, 3 are appointed and 2 are volunteers. The 2 that are volunteers are architects. Anyway, they didn't show, or they didn't say that they'd be taking down Maribor. And I got wind of it from this organization. It's a not-for-profit. It's been around since 1997. It's called the Cultural Landscape Foundation. And they are, their mission is to educate and to advocate to preserve existing essential or important landscapes, architectural buildings, sculptures, whatever. And they've had a very good track record. And it's headed by Charles Birnbaum. And he called me and he said, do you know that, they're doing this? And I said, no. He said, well, we need to get you on board. Would you want us to support you? And they have a machine. It was really amazing. They got publicity letters from many people. They asked me to suggest people to write letters. And believe it or not, and I hardly believe it, when the Washington, D.C. Review Board met again, Charles and the organization filed a petition. And they said, you can't go ahead with this. And in truth, they said, well, you're right. The architects who are making this new pavilion and making the change did not provide complete information. So a couple of months went by. They have a meeting every month. And then finally at the last meeting, they said to the people, you have to either provide a new home for Maribor, relocate the pavilion so it doesn't impact Maribor, or locate it so that it envelops Maribor. So I was not invited to this meeting. I don't know who the architects are. Charles and his team say they are a local, small company that have they don't have a national reputation. They haven't done anything that has been written about or documented. So it's a cheap building anyway. It's just a glass box. It's not anything but an entry pavilion. So I'm waiting to see what happens. But I was really touched by how many people wrote letters and the different kinds of people, most of whom I knew, some I didn't know. And it was really, but this is all at the beginning of this pandemic. Yeah. And I had a lot of work to do with that. So.
But amazing that somehow the artist managed to prevail in the midst of all of these other sort of forces coming together. I think it's stunning. Like you, and I do remember when you sent around the initial kind of alert, almost, hey, this is happening, and please support this effort to find some way to preserve, to, like you said, possibly move or whatever it would be, but not just to ignore it, pretend it doesn't exist. So I have to say that in the midst of all of this stuff that was happening, in some ways, when that news came through, I thought, oh, this is another 2020, moment. But look how it's turned out so far.
So far, we don't know. I mean, I never count. And I have to say that I've done a lot of projects over the years, and some of the largest and some of the more significant ones have been either modified or erased. And in San Francisco, in Chicago, just gone,
And it was destroyed because it was located at the World Trade Center prior.
Oh, well, that was something that was, the fountain that I did there and the memorial, it meant so much to the 6 families who lost their loved ones who were working and were killed in that initial attack.
In the earlier bombing in the parking garage.
Yeah, it was But they weren't just pulling the van into the parking garage. They did know that where they parked the van, they were hoping it was at the point where Tower 1, Tower 2, and the hotel, it's right in the middle of those 3 things. They were hoping that it would just all of it would come caving in. It wasn't strong enough, but that was their plan.
So you've had that and other works of art by other artists, that were destroyed obviously in that as well. I mean, it was, I'm looking at the time and I'm seeing that we're moving towards just a couple minutes left, and I wanted to ask you about the award, 2016 award, the Noguchi Award that you received. Was that sort of an important moment you shared with the amazing Tadao Anzo, amazing like you?
He's one of my heroes, and just to be on the stage with him. I had spent a year in Japan on a fellowship, and I had learned to speak enough Japanese to get by like a 5-year-old, you know, just to make my way around the country there. And anyway, but I decided I was going to give my acceptance speech in Japanese, which he did as well. Although he understands English, he doesn't like to speak it. But I stumbled through, and he was very gracious, and he said it was okay. But yeah, that was nice. You know, it's nice to be recognized, and that was the same time, that 2016. I had an exhibition at Grounds for Sculpture, which is a place it's in between Trenton and Princeton, New Jersey. It's how many acres? 60 acres, 70 acres. And they have a collection, and they also have work spaces for people. And it was a nice opportunity because, I don't know, it's not easy to move these things around. And they were able to collect 4 or 5 of them and put them on site.
Amazing.
The smaller pieces I call sculptures.
Well, that's those are positive things, all positive developments, hopefully to be joined by others. And of course, we miss you out on the West Coast. We know that you're on the East Coast. We hope to see you more out on the West Coast when you're able to move again and sort of.
I was in the process, which you might have heard from Astrid or Lita. I was looking for a place to move to because I've gone through over 40 East Coast winters. And I'm getting a little too old for that. And it's, I was thinking it's time to sit by the sea in Santa Monica and hang out. But right now, I don't think anybody's moving anywhere. So it's a very, very strange time.
Any last words of thoughts before we sign off?
Well, I kind of hope that things get better after the elections, and that I've also been really involved with the environment, you know, with conservation efforts. And I was 15 years on a conservancy board for the Land Conservancy in Columbia County, where I had a house. And I learned a lot, read a lot, studied it. We're truly in a crisis that way, in that realm, as well as political, social justice and so on. And I just think the world is too precious to just, you know, toss it the way we are with our habits and our lifestyles and so on. And I'm guilty as everybody else, but I hope something turns it around. I do.
I don't think you're alone in that hope. I think that we're all sort of there with you. And hoping that there's be some real change coming up in a few months. So fingers crossed. Elyn, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for being part of this. And I'm going to go ahead and end the recording now.
Okay.